Parts during Friday evening and across the north as well. The cloud thickening, so some patchy rain over the Western Isles, the Highlands and the Northern Isles as we head into the weekend. And we always like to see some cloud and rain across Western Scotland. Probably not much in Glasgow, and certainly further south. Most places will be dry on Saturday. Some sunny spells for Aberdeenshire and down the eastern side of England as well. We should see some sunshine. Generally, though, fairly cloudy, and where it's pretty glum, temperatures could struggle, 6-7 degrees. Again, the top temperature probably in the far northwest, where there will be some patchy rain this weekend. But apart from that, most of us staying dry with light winds, quite a lot of cloud. Some places there will see some blue sky.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hey, welcome along. I'm Mark Steyn, live on GB News TV and GB News Radio. Feel free to watch or listen according to taste, or do a little of both. Mix and match. A bit of a mélange, as the baristas like to say. How do you feel about columnists who become politicians? We have the contrasting approaches of Boris Johnson and Eric Zemmour. Plus, when the state can require biometric ID and your medical records in order for you to access a cappuccino and a stale Danish, what can't the state do? And as always, the indispensable part of the show, your questions and comments by email, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GBNews. And Stump the Steyn is coming up, so tweet away. All that after Polly Middlehurst with the news.
Mark, thank you. The top story this hour, Boris Johnson says he's adamant there's no evidence to support allegations of blackmail made by a senior Conservative MP. Chair of the Public Administration Committee, William Ragg, had said that rebels who'd like to oust the Prime Minister have faced pressures and intimidation. While speaking during a tour of a medical centre, Boris said the claims were simply unfounded.
I've seen no evidence, heard no evidence to support any of those allegations. And what I'm focused on is what we're doing to deal with the number one priority of the British people, which is coming through COVID.
Boris Johnson. Meanwhile, a former Conservative MP who has defected to the Labour Party, Christian Wakeford, claims he was threatened about the loss of a school in his constituency if he didn't toe the party line. Tory MP Andrew Bridgen told GB News earlier he has heard reports of intimidation.
I've seen a little bit of it myself. It's tremendously serious. This is not the first leadership challenge or confidence vote I've been involved in. I've seen it happen with David Cameron. I've seen it happen with Theresa May, but I've never encountered intimidation like this. This is something completely different. It's very, very serious.
The US president has warned that if Russian military forces cross the border with Ukraine, the US will consider it an invasion, which will be met with a severe response. Joe Biden's comments come as the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also said the EU will respond with massive economic and financial sanctions. Here's what President Biden had to say.
I've been absolutely clear with President Putin. He has no misunderstanding. If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion. But it will be met with severe and coordinated economic response.
President Biden. A lorry driver who tried to smuggle cocaine worth £2.1 million into the UK has been jailed for 9 years. The 39-year-old Polish national was investigated after he was stopped at the port of Dover last November. Border Force officers found the drugs in brown taped packages hidden behind wooden boards at the back of his truck. Here, most BT customers will see their bills rise by more than 9% from the end of March. In a statement, the telecoms giant said it follows a huge increase in data usage over the past few years. Those affected will end up paying, on average, an extra £42 a year for telephone and broadband. However, financially vulnerable households and those on certain packages will be exempt from the hike. On TV, online, or through your radio on DAB+, you're with GAB News, or GB News even. Now time to get back to Mark Steyn.
What did Polly just call it there? JAB News. I don't think I want to. JAB. I don't want to be on the Jab News net. We've got enough jabs. Don't worry, we're going to get to the soap operatics of the Conservative Party eventually. But as you might have gathered from yesterday's show, a prolonged contemplation of whether Jeremy Hunt or Liz Truss is the saviour the nation's crying out for makes me want to grab a pencil and stab my eyeballs out. Don't try that at home, boys and girls. Not because I care about your eyeballs one way or the other, but because there's a 3-year waiting list for eyeball implants on the NHS. I think it's a supply chain thing. They all made round the back of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Whether or not COVID is still a thing now that Omicron has proved a bust, COVID regimes are still a thing. Today, the government of Austria just voted, has approved passed its mandatory vaccination law by 137 votes to 33. So not a lot of Austrian legislators are willing to oppose mandatory vaccination. Meanwhile, the Great Reset Jet Set have just kicked off this year's World Economic Forum at Davos. What, you weren't invited? Well, just to confirm that we're now living in a weird world of public health globalists, China's Chairman Xi was the warm-up act for America's COVID honcho, Chairman Fauci. It's fitting, as they're basically business partners in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. As Douglas Murray said on this show a couple of weeks back, the world gets a China virus, the world gets a little more like China. Indeed, the principal lasting effect of COVID-19 appears to be that formerly free peoples get a little more gung-ho for authoritarianism and the firm smack of all-powerful government. Every weekend on the continent, there are huge demonstrations against vaccine passports, lockdowns, COVID coercion in France, Austria, the Netherlands. And every weekend, these protests go all but unreported in the Western media, even though they're often bigger than BLM or Extinction Rebellion or whatever's your bag. And when they do make the papers, they're covered in curious ways. Here's the independent's way of looking at it. Unparalleled threats. Anti-vaxxer movement threatens a new wave of extremism. As police foil a string of anti-vaxxer plots across Europe, there are growing fears that radicalization could lead to violence. So it's not enough that, as Justin Trudeau says, the unvaccinated are racists, and as Monsieur Macron says, they're not even real citizens. The Independent thinks they're domestic terrorists in waiting. To be sure, these unvaccinated jihadists haven't done anything yet. They haven't stabbed any MPs or driven rental cars through Christmas markets. But there are, quote, growing fears and, quote, unparalleled threats. Novak Djokovic had to be booted out of Australia because, as the immigration minister argued in court, quote, his presence in Australia may foster anti-vaccination sentiment leading to A, other unvaccinated persons refusing to become vaccinated, B, other unvaccinated persons being reinforced in their existing views not to become vaccinated. Unquote. If Djokovic were to remain in Australia, he might say something that might cause Mrs. Scroggins of Alice Spring to be reinforced in foregoing her 7th booster shot. Next thing you know, she'd be radicalizing into one of those incipient domestic terrorists. What can you do if you think your neighbor might be unvaccinated? Well, in East Germany, they advise you to turn them into the Stasi. Oh, no, sorry, my mistake. That's not East Germany, that's Canada.
Puis qu'est-ce qu'on devrait faire avec les gens qui veulent pas se faire vacciner?
On devrait appeler la police.
Oui.
S'ils n'ont pas leur vaccin, ça peut mettre beaucoup de personnes en danger. Fait que comme le gouvernement est en train de faire en ce moment, il faut leur couper petite chose à petite jusqu'à temps qu'ils se donnent et qu'ils se fassent vacciner.
En tout cas, on a des futurs politiciens à côté de nous.
That's awful cute, isn't it? That's Julie Snyder, who's a big deal in Quebec. She's best pals with Celine Dion, who sang the theme from Titanic, My Heart Will Go On no matter how many booster shots I get. The sight of telly presenters applauding primary school kids for wanting to turn their neighbours into the coppers ought to make audiences feel a wee bit queasy about where all this is headed. What do you reckon? You can email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at gbnews. Yesterday, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, who are the soul of moderation, nobody's idea of fringe whack-job extremist nutters, sent a very strong letter to the Chief Medical Officer in Dublin, copied to the Taoiseach, calling for an end to the COVID vaccine pass system. This phrase in the letter leapt out at me. Additionally, whenever a state considers deploying a surveillance tool, such as a vaccine pass, a surveillance tool such as a vaccine pass. Bingo. That's what it is. John McGurk, who's the editor of Gript, which is a rare beacon of hope on the somewhat somnolent Irish media scene. That's Gript, G-R-I-P-T. That's how it's spelt. John joins me from Tipperary. John, it's not a good day when you, as the virus itself seems to be fading. Governments seem to be doubling down, not all, but a lot of them seem to be doubling down on this permanent regulation of our lives. The Austrian thing, mandating vaccines for everyone, every adult in the country, is a disturbing sign. What's your view of this?
I would broadly agree. I think that one of the things that's more disturbing than government action, particularly from the perspective of where I'm sitting here in Ireland, is how popular some of these measures have become in a very short period of time. Since the Irish government introduced vaccine passports, they were originally introduced on the basis of the idea that they would reduce the spread of the disease, that they would stop people from catching COVID, and that they would encourage people to get vaccinated. And In that time, there has not been one shred of evidence presented to the public that suggests that they actually do either of those things. We have not had one scientific paper showing that vaccine passports reduce the spread of COVID one way or the other, or that they have meaningfully increased the number of people vaccinated one way or the other. In fact, since they were introduced, the rate at which new people are becoming vaccinated has actually slowed, mainly because in Ireland we very quickly reached the high 80s in percentages and are now in the mid 90s. So these measures remain targeted at essentially in Ireland. And I'm, by the way, I'm triple boosted myself for better or worse. But there are 7% or so of the Irish people who are not vaccinated. And yet we have this immense public focus on that 7% as if they are the root cause of all the nation's problems. And as you alluded to, here in this country, the media coverage on this issue has been entirely in one direction. We're now at a position where we had hundreds of thousands of cases, which in Ireland, we have a very small population, about 5 million people. We've had hundreds of thousands of cases in January alone of this virus. The wave is falling. At no point was our hospital or health system threatened. We are told that these measures are in place for a public health emergency, and yet, if you look around at this point, there is no actual sign that there is a public health emergency. That's the thing I think that disturbs people. We have something in Ireland that dictates our policy called the National Public Health Emergency Team, which is a series of medics who basically meet and announce what the government may or may not do in effect. The government then listens to them. But when you think about that name, public health emergency, we don't have a public health emergency. There isn't a public health emergency in the UK or in Scotland or in Wales or in Ireland, and yet we still have measures which are directed at mitigating the effects of this emergency by effectively targeting a small portion of the population who are viewed, quite absurdly in my view, as dangerous.
Well, let me ask you about that and the two aspects of it. The first of which you've mentioned is that a lot of these measures are extraordinarily popular with people. And if you look at polls, 75% of Canadians are gaga for all this lockdown stuff. In Australia, it's similar numbers. They're only arguing about whether it should be the federal government or the state government that locks them down. They're popular in a way that restrictions on liberty have generally not been popular in the Anglophone democracies. It's something new, that. And could I also ask you the second part of that? Why do you think it's so necessary for governments to otherize, as they say on the left, to otherize the unvaccinated? Because that's what the Austrians are doing, that's what the French are doing, that's what the Dutch are doing. And again, it seems to be as if they need a villain in this story. And, you know, the real villain is the guys in the Wuhan Institute who let this thing escape and rampage across the world, but no one seems to have the guts to take them on. So instead we have a sort of pantomime villain in which the unvaccinated are being excoriated in most parts, certainly in most parts of continental Europe and in places like Australia and Canada as well.
So in answer to your first question in relation to why are these measures popular, I think what they have exposed is a sort of collectivist instinct in population. This idea that we face a common threat that can only be defeated by collective action. That is, as you know, Mark, a very popular idea, has been a very popular idea and a disastrous one for generations. Century, ever since Karl Marx first thought of it. This idea that, you know, nothing can be achieved unless we come together and work as a collective in society. And that's been a very addictive idea. And people are really struggling to let that idea go. Just today in Ireland, for example, we are presently debating whether to lift some of our COVID restrictions, which at the moment mean that as of 15 minutes ago, pubs and restaurants closed in Ireland at 8 p.m. because things are so dangerous apparently. We're having a debate about whether those restrictions will be lifted tomorrow. And earlier this evening, one of the news programs here, the mainstream news programs, put on a medic saying that we have to be very cautious about reopening on the basis that there could yet be a new variant. And when you think about what she's actually saying there, she's saying the pandemic can never end. Because if you must constantly be cautious because there's a new threat coming, if you must constantly worry about the next variant, the next threat, what might emerge from an unvaccinated country in Southeast Asia or in Africa, then you're effectively saying we can never get back to normal. That's the argument, I think, which people are being drawn into constantly, that the threat is constantly there, that it might strike at any moment, that you are constantly facing a threat. So that is the popularity element of it, I think. In relation to why people are being targeted as a minority, I think there's, I'm from Ireland, which is always has been a particularly tribal society. Our prime minister is called the Taoiseach, which translates literally as chief. We've always been a society that's been very much, when there's a national threat, everybody puts on the national jersey and pulls in the same direction, and dissent is not hugely encouraged. And I think there has always been an extent to which we have been willing to point at the minority in our midst and say they are a fifth column. None of these ideas are new. They've been repeated throughout history time and time and time again. And what's more, I think, with vaccine passports in particular, since that's what we're discussing, is that they also function not just as a medical tool, but almost as a certificate of good citizenship. The idea that I have my vaccine passport means I have done my part. I have served, if you like, in the great war on COVID, which has been lost, but nobody seems to have noticed that. I've served, I've done my bit, I'm a good citizen. If you don't have yours, it marks you out, almost in American parlance, as a draft dodger. And that is the kind of, it's become a kind of warped, almost form of nationalism in some countries, particularly if you look at Australia. I think the attitudes to Djokovic are massively nationalist, which is very funny coming from people who call people like me the extreme right. You want to see extreme right nationalism in action, look at the people who are saying that you are not a good citizen unless you reveal all your personal data to the state, stamp your vaccine passport and show it on demand. And yet anyone who objects to this is the extremist. It's a paradox which I can't understand. Maybe you can explain it.
Well, it's a funny thing to me. Certain commentators, like Andrew Neil, for example, was writing the other day, who regards himself as a friend of liberty. I don't think he is. He's saying, oh, but it's so easy. He's sitting in the south of France and he goes to a restaurant and it's on your telephone, which you have with you all the time anyway, and you just show the QR code and it certifies that you're eligible to enter this restaurant and have a saumon tartare or whatever Andrew enjoys of an evening. This seems to me the idea that you can't just walk into a joint and throw a handful of euros on the table and have a cup of coffee anymore. That seems actually to me to be a big change in society, and accepting it is not something that free people should do lightly. It is, I mean, I'm not a conspiracy-minded guy, but that is social credit as the Chinese see it, isn't it?
It is, and it's interesting to me that you mention Andrew. I think had this situation been proposed to Andrew in 2017, that he would require one of these passes to enter a bar in the south of France, I think he would have been beside, I don't know about you, but certainly me on the barricades saying, no, absolutely not. Yeah. This is an outrageous infringement of liberty. No. And yet his view appears to have been changed. And I think what's interesting in this is that it is no longer, what's difficult in discussing with these people is that it's no longer necessarily a rational belief, in that there is, in theory, not one I would agree with, but there is in theory a rational case for vaccine passports. And that case would be if the vaccine was sterilized. In other words, if it could prevent you from getting the illness and transmitting it to others, and the illness was of such a severity that it caused widespread death, then you could say this is a tool that might at least work. But the most extraordinary thing about vaccine passports is that nobody anywhere in the world can produce any evidence of any kind in any form to say that they actually accomplish anything meaningful on an epidemiological level. They don't reduce, I'm talking about the vaccine passports now, don't reduce infection, they don't prevent transmission, they effectively don't prevent people gathering in non-approved areas in large groups if they so wish. They don't serve any medical purpose whatsoever. The only purpose which they seem to serve is a political purpose. And like you, anyone who reads what I write regularly will know that I abhor conspiracy theories. I think a lot of conspiracy theories, and some of them, by the way, on representing the view that I represent here, are wrong and go too far and come across as a little bit crazy. But the fact is there's no rational reason for this policy still to be in place at this stage of the pandemic, if there was ever a reason for it to begin with. And what we're seeing, I think, is a very traumatized Western world that has yet to come to terms with the massive changes it's imposed upon itself in the last 2 years. And it's going to take an awful lot, unfortunately, to unwind those. I'll leave you with the fact that in Ireland, as I say, we're talking about allowing pubs to open tomorrow, get back to normal, remove restrictions. But as of yet, there is no talk of removing these vaccine passports, which seem to be the last thing that COVID cautious people want to stick to indefinitely. And I think that's particularly worrying.
You know, it's an interesting point you make there. It's like there's not even a utilitarian argument, because the weaker the vaccines get, the worse their performance is, the more the government of Austria is determined to make everybody get it. Thank you for giving us your view, John, and you certainly put your mouth and your money coordinated, because you've called for the entire public health emergency team in Dublin to step down, as well they should. Let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.uk. Oh, and you can ask me anything on Stump the Steyn too. That's at GB News View Twitter aficionados. Don't go nowhere, as the Paymaster General says of Boris. We'll be coming right back with your take.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farrar, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Mark Steyn live on GB News TV and live on GB News Radio. Let's get straight to your comments. Alfie says vaccine passports need consigning to the history books, never to return. Preach it, brother Alfie. Dave, however, says human rights are not determined by personal dislike or perception of freedom. Pay attention to this, actually, because this is a bit of a jaw-dropper. Human rights are not determined by personal dislike or perception of freedom. They are specified in laws devised to protect individuals and the wider society. If the law requires you to have a vaccine, it does not infringe human rights. I don't know which website you downloaded that from. I don't know whether you've got a diploma in human rights from a website in Uzbekistan or whatever, Dave. But that's precisely the opposite. Human rights are not specified in laws. They're not rights that the state gives you. Go back and get out Magna Carta, 1215, whatever that island, Runnymede, is in the middle of the Thames, and take a look at that. Because that is what human rights are. Human rights are restraints upon the sovereign, upon the king. The king can't just make a law and force you to comply with it. That human rights are restraints upon the state. They're not things that the state can do to you. They're not restraints upon you. They're restraints upon the state. And if you don't get that, you don't get human rights at all, Dave. I'm sorry about that. But maybe a couple more booster shots and you'll be all comfortable with it. Yes, they are surely, says an anonymous Twitter user. Where there is risk, there must be choice without prejudice. Medical freedom is a basic human right. Yeah, just to go back on that, if the state can decide, or if the guys at Davos or the WHO can decide that all 7.5 billion people are going to be prescribed the same medicine, whether they want it or not, then there are no human rights, because you don't even have bodily autonomy if they can decide what juice they're going to shoot into your veins. Thank you for that. Keep your emails and tweets coming. Stump the Stein will be right along before we close things out. How do you feel about a newspaper columnist deciding he wants to be head of government? No, I'm not talking about Boris Johnson. Boris figured he'd taken the minor celebrity of media commentator about as far as he could. He wanted something more commensurate with the size of his ambition, even if he had no particular idea what he'd do if he achieved it. Now I'm talking about what's going on across the channel, where by contrast, Eric Zemmour has laid out a very consistent political philosophy for years and seems to have wearied of finding a viable politician to advance it, and so has decided to do it himself and run for the French presidency. From his point of view, the first round of the election is a bit like an American primary. He is to see off all the other right-of-centre candidates and come second to Monsieur Macron so that he makes it into the runoff and can go head-to-head against Monsieur Macron. How do you do that? Do you shore up your right-wing base, or do you make non-frightening genuflections toward the centre? Monsieur Zemmour is that rare thing in politics, a man of conviction. In fact, he started the week with his third conviction in a French court for inciting, quote, racial hatred. You can't buy publicity like that. On the other hand, Monsieur Zemmour has said he personally loves Brexit, but it's not practical because the French people are such losers. You'll love this quote. We fully share the diagnosis made by the Brexiteers, but France is not England. For one thing, England has won all its wars for the past 2 centuries, and we have lost all of ours. That means we don't have as much confidence in ourselves. He has a point. If they hadn't lost the Franco-Prussian War, they'd still be living under the Second Empire and things would be a lot better. Anyway, because, as he says, the French people don't have the bottle for Frexit, he's going to keep France in the EU, but he won't respect the Schengen Agreement because he wants to save France from le grand remplacement, the great replacement, that's demographic transformation. So he seems to be trying to thread a somewhat subtle needle here. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is the doyenne of Parisian commentators, and we're always delighted to see her. I'm not sure. I don't know whether a candidate in any other country could get away with saying we've lost all our wars for 2 centuries. That's why we simply don't have the gumption to pull a Brexit. Can he get away with it in France?
Well, to some extent, he can get away with it because on the specific issue of Brexit, what the French don't like about Brexit for themselves, about Frexit, if you will, is that France has done quite well from the EU as opposed to Britain. France is one of the founding members. It got the farmers protected for years, decades, through perfectly well sort of voted laws in Brussels, and there's a feeling that we can make that work for us, and if we don't make that work for us, we do not respect our commitments. And some other French politicians have said that clearly. They said, if there's a law or a treaty that we don't like, it takes forever to apply it, if ever. And once Britain signed up to laws, then to European regulations, they applied them to the letter because that's the way the British are. So I think there's also that in the background. But it's also worth reminding people that Éric Zemmour is a man who has been denouncing the pessimism of the French, and what he calls the French suicide is the name of one of his books, and where he says that France is going to the wall essentially because she doesn't have the courage of her own convictions, and she is not defending her civilization and many other things. So it goes with what he says, and it only works on his supporters, but he's got lots of supporters. His campaign and his polling has flagged a bit recently, but by and large, he is the newest and most sort of interesting thing to come out of what was supposed to be a very boring race and is becoming interesting largely because of him.
Well, when you say it was going to be a very boring race, that's because it would have been Monsieur Macron up against the house-trained centre-right candidate. And instead, he thinks that I'm just putting it that way because that's what it is. She hasn't got quite enough red meat for a lot of people on that side of the aisle. His first job was to take out Marine Le Pen. And then his second role is to take out the mushy right candidate. Do you think he's got a real shot at winding up in the runoff?
I think even though his numbers flagged, I mean, at one stage he was number 2. You know how this goes in France. What you call the French way of doing primaries. You have the first round, and in the first round, everybody who's got 500 elected officials throughout the country to support them can run, and people get to choose. And the second round, the runoff, 2 weeks later, is where you've got number 1 and number 2, and they slug it out, and then we vote for one of them. And the Republican Party took some time, the centre-right party of de Gaulle and Sarkozy, although de Gaulle probably would not recognize it today. They voted for Valérie Pécresse, who is a respectable woman. She was Minister of Universities until Sarkozy, and then she was Secretary for the Budget. But until the day before yesterday, I would say that, quite right, not much red meat about her. She just took on, during a live broadcast, an interview of hers, who's just been accused of sexual harassment. And she said, look, I asked myself whether I should come to this program, but assuming that, taking into account the fact that there is a presumption of innocence, I decided to come, but I would like to tell French women that I will stand for them. Now, it's not what she says, which is important here. What's interesting here is that essentially she took on a mainstream star journalist and she read him the Riot Act. And that was much more interesting than the performative feminism. It was essentially saying, yes, I have teeth. Yes, I can be tough and I can kill people. That was really interesting. Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour are essentially within the margin of error, and they're all polling something around 16, 17, 18%. And then you've got Emmanuel Macron, who's gone slightly down, but not much, from 25% to 24.5%. So he definitely comes first in the runoff. But who is going to run against him? Nobody knows.
Well, because as you said, they're all within a point or two of each other. Is there a way? And I think this is what Zemmour seems to be trying to do. Is there a way that you can actually just say something or raise an issue or put something out there that will open up 3 or 4 points between you and the two ladies? Is there a way he can do that?
It's an interesting point. Right now, the entire most of the media, all of the mainstream media are against him, and they have boxed him into a small corner where they say he's a fascist, he's a racist. There have been a series of court cases about hate speech about him. The last one is something where he was sentenced, he was fined 10,000 euros for hate speech. He was talking about immigrants to France who were supposedly minors, and he said most of them are not minors. They lie about their age, they lie about the place they come from. Many of them become rapists and thieves. We don't want them. And his barrister has been making the case that you cannot say that there's a racialism in this, because he's not mentioning an ethnicity, he's not mentioning an origin. He's just saying these people are lying and we should not get them in. He's appealing, but considering that judges in France who are civil servants skew left, we'll see what happens. And polls have been out for quite some time showing that even though Éric Zemmour gets more support than any other right-wing candidate on questions of opinion, at the same time, he is extremely divisive, and it's entirely possible that people who like the ideas have decided that the man is not the person to carry the ideas. It's a very good catch-22. It's very well worked out. So my personal bet today, but this may change, the first round is on 7th of April, is that he can't get elected, but he could get to the first round. And as it is, he's already changed the way French politicians talk, because Valérie Pécresse, whom you call quite rightly mushy, started having debates with other candidates on the centre-right, saying, I will have more people sort of sentenced, I will have the equivalent of a French Guantanamo, where people who've been sentenced for acts of terrorism, even though they have finished their prison sentence, will then be held somewhere so that is not to be dangerous for society. And all sorts of different sort of platform items that normally would never have been said. Whether she will carry these out if she's elected, now that's another question, and I suspect this is why she had this nice little number accusing a journalist the day before yesterday.
So the moderate right, the centrist right, is proposing to open a brand new Gitmo somewhere on Martinique or Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon or somewhere like that. That's what the moderate centrist right is proposing.
It's been part of not all of them are, but it's been part of the Républicain so-called primary a couple of weeks ago, and all sorts of measures about more law and order, about mandatory minimums, all sorts of measures that did not belong to their platform until Éric Zemmour came on the scene. He changed the Overton window, if you will. He pushed right the entire debate.
Yeah, that's the difference between him and Boris Johnson. Boris wouldn't care about moving the Overton window. He wants to move himself. But Monsieur Zemmour, if he changes the trajectory of French public policy, he might well be satisfied with that. We shall see. Well, we always like hearing your reports, Anne-Elizabeth, so I hope you'll come back, because you have the sharpest eye on these things. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Coming up, Stump the Stein, what's on your mind? GBviews at gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at GBnews. And if you're absolutely panting for some Boris Wither conservatism type stuff, that we can do with John O'Sullivan. Don't touch that dial, we'll be right back.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Dan Wootton, join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Mark Steyn live on GB News TV and simultaneously live on GB News Radio. We'll get to the state of the Conservative Party in a moment, but how about this yesterday from the so-called leader of the so-called free world?
I think what you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera. But if they actually do what they're capable of doing with the force amassed on the border, it is going to be a disaster for Russia if they further invade Ukraine.
Are you saying that a minor incursion by Russia into Ukrainian territory would not lead to the sanctions that you have threatened? Or are you effectively giving Putin permission to make a small incursion into the country?
Good question. That's how it did sound like, didn't it?
Oh boy, the geopolitical thigh slappers are falling thick and fast. A minor incursion, a small blitzkrieg, a modest conflagration, a Poundland apocalypse. John O'Sullivan is president of the Danube Institute in Budapest and a former speechwriter for Mrs. Thatcher. It's slightly weird to see them laughing and yucking it up at the idea of a minor incursion. What do you think Vladimir Putin makes of that? Come on down, go ahead, you can do it with impunity?
Well, I'd be worried about what Vladimir Putin thinks, but I think we also ought to ask, what do people in the region where I'm sitting, I'm Budapest, countries which border on Ukraine think? And they're all very worried. Now, the answer that you just heard was the second time he had a bite at that particular question. And his first answer was pretty good. I mean, it was fairly tough. It outlined what he would do, how he would consult with the allies and the rest of it. But then he blew it away with that foolish phrase, which, as several people suggested, was a kind of invitation to Putin. But what's the real problem for him is this, that everybody here, from Moscow to Budapest, all the way to the Atlantic coast, they know what happened in Afghanistan. And they know that however strong an American assurance is at the moment, they can't unsee those pictures. They can't forget that the Americans left billions of dollars of weaponry for the Taliban to pick up, that they left a lot of their own citizens and many more Afghans who were helping them in Afghanistan. And they say to themselves, well, what risk can we afford to take for an ally who's increasingly looking like an unreliable one when push comes to shove? It's not the first time. If you will remember, Mark, you probably will, back in 2009, I think, the Americans decided that although they had persuaded the people in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in other countries to invest a lot of political capital in installing anti-missile missiles in their countries, the Americans basically withdrew that plan, leaving them looking very foolish. And in fact, in the case of the Poles, they told them that they were not going to proceed with this defense measure. on the, I think, something like the 40th anniversary, no, sorry, the 60th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. So they're the things that count here, and people are worried.
Yeah, but given all that, why would it be in an American's interest to get into a shooting war with the Red Army on what's basically the Red Army's turf? You know the line about the Balkans not being worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier. Well, you know, to an American, to someone sitting in Ohio or Idaho, Ukraine isn't worth the bones of an American grenadier.
That is exactly what many Americans think, and an American president who wants to preserve NATO, who wants to preserve the power and the reputation and the credibility of the most successful alliance in history, which is preserving the peace of Europe and has done so effectively for a long time. That rests upon the belief that America will come to the assistance of its allies in Europe. Now, everyone's aware that Ukraine is not in NATO. That's true. At the same time, Ukraine is an independent country as a result of the end of the Cold War, as a result of agreements which Russia signed up to, and as a result of accepting the end of the Cold War and a new security structure. This is being directly challenged now by Putin, and the problem for the Americans is that although the Ukraine is not part of the alliance, if all those guarantees are forgotten, and obviously what Putin would be doing would be abandoning the agreements of a new division in the Cold War, that would threaten everybody and create instability in the whole region. Is that in the America's interest? I don't think it is, particularly at a time when America's reputation around the world and its need for is weak, and its need for allies therefore strong. I don't myself think that it would be sensible to go to war over Ukraine, but it would certainly be sensible to leave no doubt whatsoever that the penalties for the Russians pressing ahead with destabilizing the post-Cold War order have to be serious, they have to be sincere. But as you may have noticed, at the very moment when President Biden is talking about, I'm going to be consulting with our allies, we're keeping them on board, President Macron is saying we need a new alliance with a post-Cold War security of a different kind, in which the Americans are excluded, and in which includes the French, includes the Russians, and includes the Germans, and includes apparently also Ukraine. Now, if you think that's the way of the future, what you're doing is accepting the Russian theory of our European home, which excludes America.
No. Wait, just let me explore that with you, John, because it's an interesting point. Isn't there basically Putin and Chairman Xi have both concluded that America's 1950 moment is over, that the scale of humiliation in Afghanistan is such that there's no longer any need to take it seriously. If that is the case, isn't there something to be said, instead of letting Putin and Xi and the mullahs pal around together, isn't there something to be said for sending dinky little Monsieur Macron to Moscow to help peel Russia away from someone like Xi and getting Putin cozy with Germany and France and some kind of Eurocentric alternative to the poles of Xi and Washington?
Well, if you're a European country like, for example, Poland or Hungary, I think in the case of the Hungarians, you really want to have good relations with Russia. That's true. In the case of the Poles, they're much more suspicious. Would either of those countries really think, or would the Baltic states really think, that an alliance in which the principal military power on their side is Germany, which is practically a demilitarized power, and certainly and certainly a pro-Russian one, or France, which is a significant country, but is well short of being, particularly under Macron, a country rather, which is going to be a reliable military defender against the Russians. I don't think that would persuade me to feel secure. In a way, if you look at the countries bordering on Russia or bordering on Russia, you will see that all of them would like to keep NATO as the principal defender of European interests. And while that's the case, I think the Americans would be well advised to act in such a way that they continue to believe that. If they think that you think you can start a deal with Putin which excludes America and it won't have long-term consequences of European-American disengagement, you're taking an awfully big risk.
Well, let me switch subjects on you, John, and forget about the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, the Americans, and let's talk about the real global colossus. Will Boris Johnson survive?
Well, I noticed, by the way, that Boris, although most people don't seem to be noticing, Boris is actually doing more for the Ukrainians than virtually anyone else at the moment in the world in real terms.
That's true.
And I think
that's true.
So, and I think that's admirable and sensible. Now, how do I think he's doing at home? I think he's had a terrible week, and I think he's come out of it, and I think he will survive. And all kinds of normal reasons, it's hard to get rid of a Tory leader who doesn't want to go, or at the moment you don't have anybody who looks like a successful leader. He made all kinds of mistakes, and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of signs, I think, that he has looked into the abyss and the abyss has looked into him, and he's decided he doesn't want to fall down into it. And I'm told, I have one or two people, friends from previous days in Whitehall and Westminster. I'm told that at private meetings, he's made plain that he has got to move away. It's going to be difficult from a big spending policy to less spending and more and willingness to go in for tax cuts. What's the problem? Well, we're still dealing with the backwash of COVID, and we're still dealing with the fact that COVID has made everybody very security conscious. And it's very hard, in a sense, to wean people away from welfare security spending. And I think there are a lot of other calls on the British government's budget, all those things. But the fact is, my test would be net zero. I think net zero is a utopian fantasy, cannot possibly succeed, and it costs a lot of money. If he sticks with that, I can't take him seriously. But otherwise, I think he's shown the ability to risk the most terrible shellacking.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Net zero is the abyss, John. Thank you for that. It's great to see you as always. Let's do a quick bit of Stump the Stein before we go. Gareth says, if we go to war with Russia, will the unjabbed be allowed to fight? No. Any members of, I think they've actually started doing this in the United States already with their elite special forces. If you're highly trained members of the elite special forces and you're unvaccinated, you're not allowed to fight. But they're opening it up. It's more trans-friendly, the special forces in America now, so make of that what you will. Have we got another one here? Which would win over 100 metres, a horse or Boris? Well, long before the firing pistol is fired, Boris would break the horse's rear leg. That's the way you got about that. Mark, how would you sort out the after? Oh, we got no time for that. I'll see you tomorrow. Dan Wootton is standing by. Don't you go anywhere. He's the best. I'll see you tomorrow. 7 o'clock, though. Stay safe, stay free.
Hello again. It's turning cold out there. Clear skies for most, leading to a fairly hard frost, certainly for Parts of England and Wales, the coldest night of the winter. But cloud will be increasing across the northwest around this area of high pressure. We'll see more cloud already spilling into Northern Ireland and western Scotland, and that will help to keep the temperatures up here. But certainly elsewhere, frost forming out there at the moment, and it's going to just get colder and colder across the Midlands, Wales and southern England. Still a bit of cloud and 1 or 2 showers across Norfolk. They should fade away, and there's that cloud spilling into Northern Ireland and later in the night North Wales, northwest England as well, and that will help to lift the temperatures maybe back above freezing. But across the east and south, widely below freezing and well below as well, maybe as low as -6 or -7 in some rural